Have you ever caught yourself in the middle of an ordinary moment, washing dishes, staring at a window, sitting in silence after a conversation ended badly, and felt something strange rise inside you? Not sadness, not longing, something older than that. A feeling that you are watching yourself from somewhere else, that there is a witness behind your eyes who is not quite you, and yet is more you than anything you have ever been able to name. Most people shake that feeling off. They reach for the phone, turn on the television, pour another drink, because that feeling, if you let it breathe, leads somewhere terrifying. It leads to the question you were never supposed to ask. What if the self you have been protecting your entire life is not your true self at all, but only a costume? What if beneath everything you were told to be, something divine has been waiting, quietly, patiently, for you to remember? Carl Jung spent decades studying what happens when human beings lose contact with the deeper layers of their own psyche. He called it the greatest tragedy of modern life. Not poverty, not war, not illness, but the tragedy of a person who lives and dies without ever encountering who they truly are. Jung was not speaking abstractly. He was speaking about you, right now, in the life you're living, in the patterns you keep repeating, in the relationships that exhaust you, in the ambitions that feel hollow even when you achieve them. He watched thousands of patients come through his office carrying the same wound. They had been so busy becoming the person the world needed them to be that they had completely abandoned the one they were born as. And the cost of that abandonment, Jung was absolutely clear, is the source of most human suffering. The most terrifying thing, Jung said, is to accept oneself completely. Not because self-acceptance is painful, but because the self you must accept is far larger than you were ever taught to believe. Jung introduced the concept he called the self, and he was precise about the capital S, because he did not mean the ego, the personality, the social mask you wear to survive in the world. He meant something far more vast. The self, in Jung's framework, is the totality of what you are, the conscious and the unconscious, the known and the unknown, the light you display, and the shadow you have buried. And here is where Jung made a claim so radical that it still unsettles people a century later. He proposed that the self, in its deepest nature, shares its structure with what humanity has always called God. Not metaphorically, structurally. The archetypes that organize your inner life, the hero, the shadow, the anima, the wise old man, these are the same symbols that appear in every religious tradition across every culture in human history. Jung asked a simple but devastating question. Why would the same images of the divine appear inside every human mind, across every civilization, unless the divine and the human psyche were, at some level, made of the same substance? Most people spend their entire lives inhabiting what Jung called the persona, the mask constructed in childhood, refined in adolescence, and then worn so long it begins to feel like a face. You learned early what earned approval and what earned punishment. You learned to suppress the parts of yourself that made people uncomfortable and to amplify the parts that made them comfortable. You became skilled, functional, presentable, and slowly, almost without noticing, you moved further and further away from the inner world where your actual nature lives. The persona is not evil. It is necessary. But when you confuse the mask with the face, when you forget that the role is a role and begin to believe it is all you are, that is when the suffering begins. That is when you wake up at 3 in the morning with a nameless dread. That is when success feels empty. That is when you look at your own life and feel like a stranger inside it. Jung was direct. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Think about what that means for a moment. The patterns you keep repeating, the relationships that follow the same arc, the self-destruction that arrives just before victory, the fear that grips you when love gets too close. These are not accidents, and they are not weaknesses of character. They are messages from the unconscious, knocking louder and louder, asking to be heard. The part of you that keeps sabotaging your happiness is not your enemy. It is a carrier of something you buried too long ago to remember, and it will keep knocking until you open the door, not to destroy you, but to complete you. Because the unconscious is not the dungeon where your worst impulses live. It is the archive where your unlived life is stored. And then there is the shadow. Of all the concepts Jung gave the world, this is the one that most people encounter first and understand least. The shadow is not your evil twin. It is not the dark side of your personality. The shadow is everything you were told you should not be. The anger you learned to smile over. The ambition you learned to call selfishness. The need for solitude you learned to call antisocial. The grief you learned to call weakness. The shadow is the parts of your authentic self that did not survive the process of socialization. Every time someone makes you furious, what you are often seeing is a reflection of something in yourself that you have rejected. Every time you feel intense envy, what you are often feeling is an unrealized potential pointing back at you. The shadow does not want to destroy your life. It wants to be integrated into it, because you cannot become whole by cutting yourself in half. The people who drain you, who take without giving, who demand your silence, who make you feel small for being too much or not enough, these people are not simply difficult personalities. In Jung's framework, they are external mirrors of internal dynamics. The relationships that wound you most precisely are often the ones activating the most important unresolved content in your unconscious. The partner who makes you feel invisible may be echoing something your earliest caregivers taught you about your own worth. The colleague who takes credit for your work may be triggering a wound around legitimacy that was planted long before you ever entered a workplace. This does not make the harm they cause less real, but it does mean that healing cannot come only from removing them. Healing requires the harder work of confronting what inside you was already wounded before they arrived. The external villain is real, but they are also a teacher you did not choose and cannot afford to ignore. Here is what the process of individuation, Jung's word for the journey toward wholeness, is not. It is not the project of becoming a better, more optimized version of your current self. It is not the self-improvement project of sanding down your rough edges until you are easier to be around. It is not the spiritual practice of rising above your human nature into some pure, frictionless state of peace. Individuation is something far more demanding and far more interesting than any of that. It is the descent into yourself, into the shadow, the archetypes, the unconscious, and the willingness to bring back what you find there, not to display it, not to weaponize it, but to integrate it, to become a person who is no longer at war with their own nature, to stop spending your energy holding yourself together and start using that energy to actually live. Who looks outside dreams, Jung wrote. Who looks inside, awakes. This is not a metaphor about mindfulness or journaling. This is a statement about the entire direction of a human life. Most people spend their lives managing the external world, their reputation, their achievements, their relationships, their security, and never once turn the full force of their attention inward. And the tragedy is not that the inner world is terrifying, though it often is. The tragedy is that the inner world is also where the treasure is. The gold, Jung called it, the unlived life, the undiscovered gifts, the capacity for love and creativity and meaning that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, beneath the persona you built to survive. The descent is not a punishment. It is an initiation. And the life on the other side of it is categorically different from the one you are living now. Consider what it would actually mean to experience yourself as something larger than your personal history. Not to transcend your humanness, but to discover that your humanness is the very instrument through which something vast and ancient is learning to know itself. Jung believed, with a philosopher's rigor and a mystic's conviction, that the human psyche is the place where the divine becomes conscious of itself. That your longing, your suffering, your joy, your confusion, none of it is accidental noise in a meaningless universe. It is the universe, in the particular form it took when it became you, trying to understand what it is. Every moment of genuine self-awareness you experience is not just a personal victory. It is a contribution to the self-awareness of something that has no other way of knowing itself except through beings exactly like you. Begin then with something small. Begin with the person who irritates you most and ask honestly, what quality in them am I refusing to accept in myself? Begin with the dream you keep having and sit with it long enough to ask what it is trying to show you rather than what it means to escape. Begin with the emotion you always suppress in public and give it 5 minutes of your full, private attention. Begin with the role you play most automatically and ask whether you chose it or whether it chose you. These are not philosophical exercises. They are acts of radical archaeology. They are the tools Jung's approach actually gives you. Practical, uncomfortable, disorienting at first, and then slowly clarifying in a way that nothing else will. You will not find answers. You will find something better. A direct relationship with the living depths of your own psyche, which is the only thing that has ever been able to reorganize your life from the inside out. There will be resistance. Some of it will come from the world around you. The people who benefit from the version of you that does not ask questions, that does not need too much, that remains manageable and predictable, they will not celebrate this process. You may become harder to manipulate. You may become harder to guilt. You may start saying no without explaining yourself, which will confuse people who were never actually concerned with your well-being in the first place. Some relationships will not survive this, not because you became cruel, but because you became clear. And clarity, for people whose relationship with you depended on your confusion, is experienced as abandonment. You are not abandoning them. You are refusing to abandon yourself any longer. That is a different thing entirely. If this process calls to you, and the fact that you are here suggests it might, there is a body of work that will meet you where you are. Jung's own writings, and the serious engagement with his ideas that explores not just psychology, but the strange, sacred territory where the human and the divine intersect in the architecture of the self. This is not content designed to make you feel better in 20 minutes. It is designed to go somewhere real, to accompany you into the parts of your inner life that most conversations are too afraid to enter. If you are ready to stop treating your psychology as a problem to manage and start treating it as a landscape to explore, the material is there. And so is the version of you that has been waiting to be found inside it. First comes the silence. The particular silence that follows when you stop performing even for yourself. When you are alone with no audience, not even the inner one that narrates and judges and edits. Then comes the strangeness. The feeling of being both very small and somehow boundless, which is the feeling Jung described when the ego encounters the self and realizes for the first time the difference in scale. Then gradually comes the clarity. Not the clarity of having all the answers, but the clarity of knowing, for the first time, what the actual questions are. You stop asking how to get people to treat you differently and start asking why you accept the treatment you receive. You stop asking how to be more successful and start asking what success even means when it is no longer defined by fear. You stop asking how to fill the time and start asking what, underneath all the noise, you actually love. You begin to be, rather than to perform. And that shift, quiet, almost invisible at first, is the beginning of everything. You are not here by accident. The questions that brought you to this video, the discomfort that kept you watching, the feeling underneath all of it that your life is supposed to mean something more than it currently does. These are not neurotic symptoms. They are the self, speaking to you in the only language that gets through the noise. Restlessness, longing, the sensation of being almost awake. Jung spent his life arguing that the most important journey a human being can take is not outward, but inward. Not toward accomplishment, but toward wholeness. Not toward becoming someone else, but toward finally, fully becoming yourself. Tell me in the comments, are you ready to stop running from the question? Or are you already living it? Write below, I am awake, if something in this video landed somewhere real. And watch the next video. It is important, far more important than you think.